The spring of 1870 hung heavy over the Oregon Territory, where dust swirled in the air of a ramshackle trading post along the Oregon Trail, carrying the scent of pine, horse sweat, and stale tobacco. A crowd of men, their faces carved with the weariness of frontier life, gathered around a makeshift auction stage, little more than splintered planks nailed to old wagon crates. Their eyes, dulled by hard days and harder nights, glinted with a mix of curiosity and cruelty as the auctioneer, a wiry man in a faded gray coat, slammed his gavel against a post. "Last lot of the day, boys," he bellowed, his voice rough as gravel. A woman, no name given, face hidden under a sack since the Missouri border. Says she can work, says she obey. Starting bid, $2. Who's got the heart or the whiskey to take a chance on a mystery bride? Laughter cracked through the crowd like a whip sharp and mean. "Might be a hag under there," one man jeered, spitting into the dirt. "Or a ghost," another muttered, elbowing his neighbor. The woman stood silent on the platform, barefoot, her dress tattered and dust-streaked, hands bound loosely with frayed twine. The sackcloth over her head, tied tight at the neck, trembled faintly with her shallow breaths, betraying a fear she fought to hide. Her fingers twitched, clenched, then stilled, as if willing herself to be stone. "Ain't worth a dime if she won't talk," the auctioneer grumbled, scanning the crowd for takers. No one moved. The men shuffled, some turning away, others lingering to see who'd be fool enough to bid. Then, a ripple passed through the crowd as a tall figure stepped forward, parting the men like a river around a rock. Elijah Holt, a lumberjack, with shoulders broad from years of felling trees, wore a canvas coat and a black hat that shaded his weathered face. His boots, caked with mud, thudded against the earth, and his hands, calloused and steady, hung loose at his sides. $2, he said, his voice low, steady, not loud but carrying the weight of a man who spoke only when he meant it. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with surprise. The auctioneer squinted, scratching his beard. "You sure, mister? You ain't seen her face." Elijah's gaze flicked to the woman, still as a statue under the sack. "I ain't buying a face. I'm marrying a person." The words landed soft but firm, like a stone dropped into still water. No one laughed now. The auctioneer coughed, scribbling on a crumpled paper. "Name for the record, mister?" "Elijah Holt, Lumberjack, Northridge." The man nodded, then turned to the woman. "And you, miss? Your name for the marriage contract." The sack shifted, just a fraction, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a voice came, soft as a whisper on wind, so faint the crowd leaned in to hear. "Clara Wren." The name hung in the air, fragile but clear, and Elijah froze. His eyes, hidden under the brim of his hat, flickered with something sharp, a memory. From 2 winters ago, a voice in the dark, in the snow, in a moment when death had come too close. He hadn't known her name then, but that voice, that same quiet cadence, had pulled him back from the edge. He stepped forward, signing the paper without a word, then offered his arm to Clara. She hesitated, then took it, a touch light but steady. As they walked away from the stage, the crowd parted, silent, watching the lumberjack and the woman with the hidden face disappear down the trail. The pines closed in behind them, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a promise, a recognition, a thread of trust woven in the dust of a place that offered none. The trail to Elijah Holt's cabin wound through a forest of towering pines, where the air grew cooler and the light dimmed under a canopy of thick boughs, as if the sun itself hesitated to intrude. Clara Wren walked behind him, her steps careful, the sack still tied over her head, its edges fluttering faintly in the evening breeze. Elijah led an old mule laden with sparse supplies from the trading post, a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, a coil of rope, his broad back steady as he moved. Without looking back, the silence between them was not heavy, but carved from necessity, each carrying their own weight of survival. Clara's hands, unbound now, clutched the hem of her dress, her fingers brushing the frayed fabric as if grounding herself in its texture. They reached the cabin just before dusk, a sturdy structure of dark pine nestled against a rise of earth that shielded it from the north wind. A stone chimney stood proud, a stack of chopped wood neat by the door, and a single iron nail held. A weathered horseshoe above the frame. Elijah pushed the door open with a soft creak and stepped aside, his voice low but clear. "You pick where you stand in here. No one's telling you where to be anymore." Clara paused at the threshold, her breath catching under the sack, then stepped inside, her movements slow but deliberate. She didn't sit at the small table in the center, nor did she approach the cot by the wall. Instead, she crouched against the far corner, back to the room, knees drawn up, hands resting lightly on them as if ready to spring up at any moment. The sack stayed on, a barrier between her and the world. Elijah didn't comment, didn't stare. He set to work, placing the supplies on a shelf, then knelt by the stove, striking flint to kindle a fire. The scent of burning pine filled the room, followed by the warm, earthy aroma of boiling water and smoked meat, laced with a pinch of dried sage. He worked with the rhythm of someone who'd done this alone for years, his hands steady as they stirred a pot. Clara remained still, but her head tilted slightly, tracking the sounds. When the meal was ready, Elijah placed a wooden bowl near her, not too close, just within reach, and sat at the table with his own. "I call this the last stand supper," he said, his voice soft, like he was speaking to the fire more than her. "Made it for myself after long days in the woods. Always made 2 bowls, even when no one else was here." Clara's fingers twitched, but she didn't move. He stirred his bowl, the spoon scraping lightly. "Used to set the second for my sister, Mary, after she passed. She'd laugh at my cooking, but she'd eat it. Now I set it for you." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy, with meaning. Clara shifted, her head turning just enough for the sack's hem to lift, revealing the shadow of her chin. She reached for the bowl, her movements cautious, and drew it under the sack to eat, each bite small, measured, but deliberate. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts of forgotten conversations. Elijah ate in silence, his eyes on his bowl, giving her space. When she finished, she set the bowl down gently, and a sound came faint, almost. A breath, but it was there. A stifled hum that might have been a laugh, quickly swallowed. Elijah glanced up, but didn't press. That night, as he washed the bowls in a tin basin, Clara stayed by the wall, her posture unchanged, but her breathing was slower, steadier. The firelight caught the edges of the sack, and for the first time, her hands didn't tremble. As Elijah sat by the hearth later, the embers glowing low, his mind drifted to a winter 2 years back when the cold had nearly claimed him. He'd been reckless, chasing timber too far north, and a fall had left him broken in a snowbank, the world fading to white. Hands had pulled him free, rough but careful, dragging him to a shallow cave where a fire burned. A woman, her face hidden under a sack like Clara's, had tended him, her voice soft but sure, feeding him bitter broth of pine bark and lichen. She'd left before dawn, leaving only a woven bracelet of dyed wool, its pattern uneven but deliberate, tucked beside the fire. Elijah kept it still, folded in his coat pocket, a silent debt he'd carried ever since. Now, in the cabin, that same voice echoed in Clara's whispered name at the auction. He didn't speak of it, didn't ask her to confirm. He let the memory sit, a quiet bridge between them. Glancing back at Clara, still huddled in the corner, he saw not just a stranger, but a woman who'd survived her own kind of snow. The forest outside moaned with wind, but inside, the silence was different, now not empty, but waiting like the first thaw after a long freeze. Days bled into one another in the quiet of Elijah Holt's cabin, where the rhythm of chopping wood and the soft hiss of the stove became a fragile tether between Clara Wren and the world she'd long learned to fear. The forest outside stood sentinel, its pines whispering secrets to the dawn, and Clara, though still cautious, began to move with less weight, her steps softer across the worn floorboards. One morning, as the sun sliced through the mist, she slipped out alone, drawn to a lone pine at the clearing's edge, its roots gnarled like the hands of an old friend. She sat at its base, the sack still cloaking her face, but her fingers hesitated at the knot, trembling with a courage she hadn't yet named. Slowly, she loosened the twine, letting the sack slide free, and the cool air kissed her skin, tracing a scar that curved from her temple to her jaw, a jagged line etched by a night she'd fought to forget. Her breath hitched, but she didn't cover herself again. Instead, she tilted her face to the light, letting it find her, scars and all, as if daring the world to see her whole. Inside, Elijah worked in the side yard, oiling his axe, his movements steady, but his eyes catching her silhouette against the tree. He didn't approach, just watched, and when she returned to the cabin, he was at the table, carving a small wooden comb from a piece of cedar, its edges smooth as a river stone. Later that day, as the fire warmed the room, Clara stood by the stove, stirring a pot of stew, and her voice came, low but clear. "I worked in a boarding house in Kansas," she said, her words measured, like stones placed carefully in a stream. "The owner offered me a room if I gave more than labor. I refused. He didn't take kindly to that." She paused, her spoon stilling. "He came at me one night, drunk, angry. I pushed him away, harder than I meant. He fell, hit his head on the iron stove. He didn't get up." Elijah's hands stilled on the comb, but he didn't interrupt, letting her words fill the space. "They called me a murderer, said I planned it, lured him. No one listened when I said I fought to live. They sold me to settle his debts, passed me from hand to hand, and covered my face so they wouldn't have to see me." Her fingers brushed the scar, not hiding it now, just touching it, like reading a map of her own survival. Elijah set the comb down and leaned forward, his voice steady as the earth. 2 inches back, I was dying in the snow, lost up on Black Ridge. Someone found me, pulled me to a cave, kept me alive with a fire and bitter broth. She wore a sack over her face, same as you, and her voice was like yours, quiet, sure, kind. She left before I could thank her, but she gave me this. He reached into his coat and pulled out the woven bracelet, its faded colors catching the firelight. Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching as she recognized the uneven weave, the pattern she'd made in stolen moments years ago. "That was you," Elijah said, not a question, but a truth laid bare. Clara nodded, her throat tight, and for a moment, the cabin held only the sound of the fire and their shared silence. The next morning, Clara found the cedar comb on the table, placed beside a faded shawl soft, blue as a twilight sky, once belonging to Elijah's sister. No words accompanied them, just their quiet presence, an offering. Clara lifted the shawl, her fingers tracing its worn edges, and draped it over her shoulders, not to hide the scar, but to frame it, to choose how she'd be seen. She stood before the small mirror Elijah had hung by the window, her reflection no longer a stranger, but a woman who'd survived fire and snow and shame. The scar was there, deep and unyielding, but so were her eyes, fierce and alive. She tucked the comb into her hair, securing the shawl, and stepped outside, where Elijah was splitting wood. He glanced up, his axe pausing mid-swing, and his face softened not with pity, but with something like reverence. "You don't need to hide," he said, his voice low, warm. "Not here, not from me. Clara met his gaze, her scar catching the morning light, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice steady, almost defiant. "I'm choosing." The words hung between them, a bridge built from trust, and Elijah nodded, his eyes holding hers as if seeing her for the first time. Not the sack, not the scar, but Clara Wren, whole and unbroken. The forest seemed to lean in, listening, as something new took root between them, fragile but fierce, like a seedling pushing through stone. The peace that had settled over Elijah Holt's cabin was a fragile thing, like dew clinging to pine needles before the sun burned it away. A week after Clara Wren shed her sackcloth, a shadow crept into the Northridge trading post, carried on. The lean frame of Jasper Kane, a bounty hunter whose gray eyes cut through the saloon's haze like a blade through fog. His duster, torn from weeks on the trail, hung heavy with dust, and his voice, smooth as ice, asked after a scarred woman rumored to be hiding in the hills, wed to a lumberjack. The locals, wary of his stillness, the kind that promised violence, offered vague answers, but Jasper's questions were too sharp, his gaze too keen, lingering on the path to Elijah's cabin. By midday, he'd learned enough, his boots leaving deep prints as he rode toward the ridge, a predator scenting blood. Elijah crossed paths with him near the supply shed, where the air smelled of sawdust and iron. Jasper posed as a drifter seeking work, his words polite, but his eyes scanned the tree line with the precision of a hawk. Elijah's gut tightened. He knew a hunter when he saw one, not by the man's talk, but by the way his hand rested near his holster, ready but unhurried. That evening, Elijah returned to the cabin, his face etched with a quiet urgency. "He's coming for you," he told Clara, his voice steady but low, like a warning drummed into the earth. She stood by the stove, stirring a thin soup, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, the scar on her cheek catching the firelight. Her eyes met his, not with fear, but with a resolve that had grown in the days since she'd faced her reflection. She crossed the room, opened a small chest by the cot, and pulled out the sackcloth, its folds still carrying the weight of her past. "I'll wear it again," she said, her voice firm, not trembling, not to hide, but to draw him out. Elijah frowned, his hands clenching. "You don't need to face him alone." Clara's gaze held his, unflinching. "I'm not alone. But this is my fight, and I choose how to meet it." They sat by the fire, plodding under its flickering glow. Clara would ride east along the old fire road, the sack over her head, a ghost to lure Jasper into the open. Elijah would take the mountain pass, swift and unseen, to fetch the sheriff and his men from town. If the plan held, Jasper would follow her, thinking her vulnerable, and ride straight into a trap. At dawn, the sky barely pink, Clara mounted Elijah's spare horse, a sturdy Marries with a calm eye. She tied the sackcloth tight, its rough weave familiar but no longer a cage, her heart pounding not with fear but with purpose. She rode out, the forest swallowing her silhouette, while Elijah took the pass, his horse's hooves muffled by pine needles. The day stretched long, the air thick with the threat of rain. Jasper took the bait, his shadow trailing Clara through the rocky eastern hills, his horse's gait steady, predatory. She kept her pace even, her hands steady on the reins, sensing his presence like a storm at her back. By late afternoon, she reached a narrow gorge, its walls steep and shadowed, where Elijah had promised to wait. Jasper closed in, his hand on his pistol, but before he could draw, hoofbeats thundered from the ridge above. Elijah emerged with the sheriff and 2 riders, their rifles glinting in the fading light. "Drop it, Kane," the sheriff barked, his voice cutting through the silence. Jasper's eyes darted, calculating, but the numbers were against him. He raised his hands, his pistol falling to the dirt, and the sheriff's men bound him, his curses swallowed by the wind. Clara watched from a high ledge, still cloaked in the sack, her breath steady now. When Jasper was tied and slung over his horse, charged with unlawful pursuit and intent to harm, she rode down. Elijah met her, his hand gentle as he helped her dismount. She reached up, untied the sack, and let it fall, her scar bare to the world, her eyes fierce with triumph. "This was the last time," she said, folding the cloth with deliberate care. Elijah nodded, his voice soft but sure. "You turned it into a weapon." She looked at him, the weight of her past lighter now, not gone, but reshaped. "It saved me because I chose how to use it," she said, tucking the sack under her arm, not as a burden but as a trophy. The gorge stood quiet, the sheriff and his men, leading Jasper away, and Clara stood beside Elijah, the forest stretching vast around them. For the first time, she felt not like prey, but like a woman who'd outrun her hunter, not by fleeing but by standing her ground. The sky darkened, promising rain, but Clara's gaze was clear, fixed on the path ahead, where freedom felt closer than ever. The forest around Elijah Holt's cabin exhaled a quiet relief in the days following Jasper Kane's capture, as if the pines themselves sensed the easing of a long-held tension. Clara Wren moved through the mornings with a new steadiness, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, the scar on her cheek no longer a secret but a mark she carried without shame. She spent hours by the creek, washing linens or gathering wild herbs, her hands finding purpose in small tasks that tethered her to this new life. Yet, the shadow of her past lingered, a faint echo of the accusations that had driven her from Kansas. One afternoon, as the sun hung low, painting the clearing gold, a soft knock came at the cabin door. Elijah opened it to find a woman standing there, her dress patched but clean, her dark skin glowing in the fading light, her eyes cautious but warm. "I'm Lila Hayes," she said, twisting a warm bonnet in her hands. "Used to cook at the boarding house in Kansas. I heard Clara was here, and I couldn't stay silent no more." Clara stepped into the doorway, her breath catching as she recognized Lila's face, a ghost from a life she'd fled. Lila's gaze softened, but she didn't step closer. "I saw what happened that night," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "Saw that man drag you to the back room, heard the struggle, the crash when he fell. I should have spoken up then, but I was scared, needed the work, needed to eat. I ain't proud of it, but I'm here to make it right." Clara's fingers tightened on the doorframe, her eyes searching Lila's face, finding truth in the lines of regret etched there. Elijah gestured to the table, and they sat, the fire casting a warm glow over the rough wood. Lila spoke in a low, careful voice, recounting the night in vivid detail, the owner's drunken advance, Clara's desperate push, the stove's iron edge meeting his skull. "You fought to live," Lila said, her eyes meeting Clara's. "I saw the bruises, the blood on your face. It wasn't murder. It was survival." Clara's throat tightened, but she nodded, the weight of years of being called a liar lifting just a fraction. Elijah pulled a sheet of paper from a drawer, his movements deliberate, and handed Clara a quill. Together, they helped Lila shape her testimony, her words flowing onto the page in strong, careful script. She described the boarding house, the man's threats, the silence of a town too quick to judge a woman alone. When Layla signed her name, her hand shook, not with fear, but with the resolve of someone righting a wrong long buried. Elijah sealed the affidavit in an envelope, and Clara rode with him to the trading post, where a courier took a territorial judge. Weeks passed, the forest turning greener, the air warming with the promise of spring. Clara and Elijah fell into a rhythm-chopping wood, tending the garden, sharing quiet evenings by the fire, each moment a step towards something unspoken but growing. One morning, hoofbeats broke the stillness, and the sheriff rode up, a single envelope in his hand. Elijah took it, his eyes scanning the words before he carried it inside. Clara stood by the table, her hand steady as she broke the seal. The letter was brief, its words stark. Charges against Clara Wren dropped. Case closed. Warrant rescinded. She read it again, then a third time, the paper trembling in her hands, not from fear, but from a quiet, overwhelming relief. Without a word, she walked out, past the woodpile, past the grazing mar, to the lone pine at the clearing's edge where she'd first bared her face. She knelt, her fingers digging into the soft earth, and buried the sackcloth she'd carried from the gorge, its folds now a relic of a life she no longer lived. The moss felt cool under her hands, the air clean, and she closed her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have to run anymore," she said. The words not for Elijah or Lila, but for herself, for the woman who'd fought through snow and shame to reach this moment. Elijah stood at a distance, his axe resting against a stump, watching her with a quiet pride. When she rose, her shawl catching the breeze, she turned to him, her scar glinting in the sunlight, her eyes clear and fierce. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for standing by me when I couldn't stand alone." He nodded, his gaze warm, unwavering. "You were never alone, Clara. Not since that snow." The forest hummed around them, alive with birdsong and the rustle of new leaves, and Clara felt the weight of her past not vanish but shift, like a stone rolled aside to let light through. Justice had come, not loud or triumphant, but soft, like the truth Lila had carried across miles to deliver. Clara walked back to the cabin, her steps lighter, her heart no longer a fugitive's, and the pine stood tall behind her, guarding the earth where her prison now rested. Spring unfurled across the Oregon ridge, softening the forest's edges with buds that bloomed like quiet vows, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers pushing through the earth. Elijah Holt worked with steady hands, building a simple arbor outside the cabin, 4 pine beams draped with linen, sturdy yet unassuming, like the man himself. Clara Wren watched from the porch, her shawl loose around her shoulders, her scar catching the morning light as she stitched a veil from the same blue fabric, weaving tiny ferns along the edges with thread she'd unraveled from an old shirt. She and Elijah had spoken little of what came next, but their shared glances over coffee at dawn, across the fire at dusk, held a promise that needed no words. They decided to renew their vows, not for the law that had bound them at the auction, but for themselves, for the trust they'd carved from silence and survival. The day came soft, the sky clear, the forest humming with life. Lila Hayes arrived, her smile wide in a mismatched dress, carrying a jug of cider. The blacksmith brought a flask of apple brandy, and the shopkeeper's wife offered a basket of cornbread and a bundle of mountain lavender, their presence a quiet testament to a community that had begun to see Clara not as a stranger, but as one of their own. Inside the cabin, Clara stood before the small mirror Elijah had hung, her dress a simple cream muslin she'd sewn herself, each stitch a reclaiming of her hand's purpose. She lifted the veil, its firm patterns delicate against the worn fabric, and draped it over her hair, not to hide her scar but to frame her face, a choice that felt like freedom. She stepped outside, the forest falling still as she moved toward the arbor, her steps sure, like the earth had finally welcomed her weight. Elijah waited beneath the linen, his boots polished, his shirt free of sap stains, his eyes holding a warmth that made the world feel small and safe. He took her hands, his calloused fingers gentle, and spoke low, his voice steady as the pines. "I chose you that day at the auction, not for what was hidden, but for who you are. I choose you now, Clara, to stand beside through whatever comes." Clara's gaze met his, her eyes bright, not with tears, but with a peace she'd fought to claim. "And I choose you, Elijah," she said, her voice clear, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." No priest stood with them, no book held their words, Just the two of them and the trees and the handful of souls who'd witnessed their journey. They kissed, soft and certain, as a light rain began to fall, the drops whispering against the linen overhead. Lila leaned toward the blacksmith, her voice low. Never thought a shawl could become a veil so fine. He chuckled, sipping his brandy. It's not the shawl. It's what she made of it. That evening, as the fire crackled and laughter mingled with the rustle of leaves, Clara and Elijah sat on the porch, her veil folded in her lap, her fingers tracing the firm patterns. "This used to be my fear," she said, her voice soft, reflective. "Something to cover me, to make me less." Elijah looked at her, his hand finding hers, lacing their fingers together. "And now?" She smiled, a quiet light in her eyes, not of joy alone, but of a woman who'd walked through darkness and chosen her own path. "Now it's proof I can turn even my pain into something mine." He nodded, his thumb brushing her knuckles, and they sat in silence, the stars piercing the night above. The forest, once a place of hiding, now held them like a home, its branches swaying in a breeze that felt like a blessing. Their love didn't erase the scars or the snow or the years of running, but it reshaped them, like a river smoothing stone, into something that could carry them forward. Clara leaned against Elijah, her head resting on his shoulder, and the world felt whole, not because the past was gone, but because they'd chosen what to hold on to: a promise, a veil, a life built on trust.